Tonight we're looking at, sadly, at the subject that Anita requested, which makes the recording all the more worthwhile. But she's too sick to be here tonight. But we're talking about the image of God. What does it mean that we're made in the image of God? Which is kind of apt because in term 2, or second term of Going Deeper, because this is term 3 of the school year, obviously, we're planning to talk about the communicable attributes of God. That is, the things about God which we definitely should seek to emulate and be like, and which come to us through Christ, and we become like God in. So talking about what it means that we are made in his image is abundantly relevant. Now, there's a whole, as I dug into this and went through pages of different things on it and listened through different things on it, and I was reminded once again of just how vast a subject this is. It's massive. We're never going to get through all of it tonight. So I wanted to give a quick opening recommendation. If you want something that is a good course on the image of God that's freely available, there's the Gospel Coalition. So on their website, they have, if you click the search button at the top of their website, one of the things, there's this list of different types of content that they have, and one of them is courses. And one of them is called, The Nature of Man, or What is Man, or something like that. And they've basically just lifted the content, with permission, I believe, of a mob called Third Millennium Ministries, which are a free online seminary-ish thing that produce a whole bunch of content, because there's a lot of places in the world where you can't get a paid seminary education, or you can't afford one. And they've used their course for it, and it's really, really good. And there's a video on there specifically called The Image of God, and it's really good, really helpful. I found it great as part of my preparations for tonight. And if you want to go a bit wider on some of these things, particularly when we get to talking about the rule aspect of the have dominion aspect of the image of God, it was very, very helpful. And the ancient context as well. So I wanted to start by saying, in fact, let's if you've got a Bible, grab a Bible and open it up. That's not my Bible. I'm sure it would come as no surprise where our kind of central text for tonight's going to be. Genesis 1. There's a lot of our questions and a lot of the things we're going to talk about tonight come out of this. And we're going to go from verse 26. And so, you guys know the story, but God's created everything in 6 days. He's up to day 6. He's created the animals of the land. And then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And we'll call it there for now. So, tonight, most of the stuff we bring up, I want to start by asking it as a question, and just let us pan it out before I give you anything I've got on it. In that text, let us create man in our image and after our likeness. So is it verse 26? What do you think? And this is one that's garnered significant historical debate. Image and likeness, meaning the same thing or meaning different things? Why the two? Yeah. Look, you haven't done yourself a great deal of harm.
Some would call this poetry. I actually disagree.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I mean, whatever any of the rest of it is, verse 27 is certainly poetic, but yeah, I know what you mean. This is a detour, but I've heard those arguments of Genesis 1 is a poem, and like you, in fact, possibly because of a conversation with you, I have my doubts around that argument of the poetic structure of Genesis 1. But at the same time, if I found out that it did have something of a poetic structure, I don't think it would change anything about what I think about the passage. I think to some extent God writes his poetry on history. I've always liked the idea of that phrase. I've never had a good chance to use it until just now. Yeah. Well, look, cards on the table. So there's lots of historical debate, and historically they've held likeness and image to be different. Like a lot of periods in history, church fathers and church leaders and Reformation scholars, actually not so much Reformation scholars, up until the Reformation, it was very, very common to find them to be different. At the Reformation, they said, look, we think that they're the same. The differences were around things like people would say image refers to, say, the body, and likeness refers to the spirit, or image refers to something that is inherent to us, whereas likeness is our character being like his, and things like that. However, you get to things like Genesis 1. So looking at a few relevant passages for this, I think, helps. And we won't labour this, because obviously this isn't the main point, but... So Genesis 1:27 we've already read. Genesis 5:1, you get Adam has Seth, right? Adam and Eve have Seth. This is the only time, I think, in the Old Testament that the two words come up again together. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness after his image and named him Seth. Although somehow I deleted the word image out of my text there, but that's by the by. And so, that doesn't really conclusively answer the question, but it is interesting that in the very same book, you have it very intentionally, it would appear, come up in the same way. Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And so that takes the one to apply to all of those ideas in a way. It also gives us a really good insight into, well, is the image of God continuing after the Garden of Eden? Now that's another historical debate. So Adam and Eve, created in the image of God, right? And then they sin. What happens to the image of God? Has the image of God been lost? Has the image of God been broken and marred? Those are the two options, really, of is it completely gone? Is it partly gone? Obviously, part of that comes down to what do you call the image of God, which we're getting to. But Genesis 9 seems to indicate, the justification for non-murder, for opposing murder is man is created in the image of God. And so surely that says the image of God continues. At least in some way. So I would certainly say I think it's marred, it's broken, but it's still there. The New Testament very often picks it up and just uses the word image. And so I think what I'm trying to say here is the Bible uses them almost interchangeably. Where it uses them together, it uses them to say about the same thing. And where it uses one of them to refer back, it refers back to that whole concept that Genesis was getting at when it said in his image and after his likeness. So, for instance, 1 Corinthians 11, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. We can go into what that means more broadly another time, but you see it uses that, it's grabbing that Genesis 1 idea of the image of God. Colossians 3, he's put on the new self, or you have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator. But then James, and the only thing you might think at that point is, well, all of these use the word image, but not the word likeness. But then James, in James 3:9 says, with it, talking about our tongue, with it we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse people who are made in the likeness of God. And so the Bible seems to support the idea that they're basically used as synonyms in Genesis 1. Does that seem reasonable? I just think that's an interesting point to start out on. It's worth getting into. But what does it mean that we're made in God's image? What do you guys think of? Like when you think of, I'm made in the image of God, what aspect of you or of humanity comes to mind? I'll put a little number 1 here in faith. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly, at the very least, an implication of the image of God in us, right? Like that there is inherent dignity in humanity. We'll circle back around to that later on as well. But specifically, what about us reflects the image of God? Is it our hair? Is it not? Well, yeah, sorry, Mark. Sorry, that's a poor choice. I was actually looking at you too and I wasn't thinking about it. Just for the record, no.
I guess it's sort of coming at it from the wrong end, but for me, you can't sort of separate that idea from the fact that God became man in Christ. He didn't become an elephant.
Yep.
So somehow or other, and that of course it wasn't, that was something that was, what's the word that I'm used anyway, prepared, known, before the foundation of the world. So therefore,
Foreknown.
so when we were made in the image of God, we were made in the image of what God's Son would be.
Yeah. Isn't that a trippy thing? You go, in one sense, Jesus came down and was like us. In another sense, God made us so that he would come down. Because he wasn't man at the beginning, right? But he knew, like God is, like we looked at last term, eternal. And so God's eternal plan, God has as much established that point at which Christ would come down as the point at which he created the world. And so he knows. And so to some extent, yeah, like he creates us in the image of Christ. Maybe? Like, sort of.
And then in the New Testament, then we are being conformed to the image of Christ, so we're sort of being made back to our, what
Yeah.
we're meant to be.
And we'll get to that, but you're undermining the second half now, so it's all right. It's quite all right. So I mean, there's lots of things, right? Like when you talk about how are we made in the image of God, it's not just one thing. Do you guys remember last term when this came up? Darren had a crack at answering it, and and he, I think, pointed to the rational nature of man as a key part of us being created in the image of God. There's lots of things though. So a lot of go on.
The ruling nature of man too, that man, God put
Yeah. Okay. So
places man to lord over the creation, to rule over the creation.
ruling. You probably can't even read that because hurried writing. But anyway, all right. Rational, with that beautiful R there. Yeah. So a lot of theologians, historically, in fact, some of them even thought this was all that it meant. Talked about that is a terrible G. What they called original righteousness. And that is referring to the thing that was lost when we fell, right? So if we talk about the marring of the image of God, this is the bit that was busted, that we don't really have anymore. Lost in the fall and being regained in Christ is what that is. And so, we could pick up on this by looking at that verse a few after the one that we read just before. God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And, you get the other 5 days of creation, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And God saw that it was good, rather. And then you get to day 6, and after humanity have been added as the cherry on top, the creation is very good. Because we were created very good. God looked at us and he didn't see something he disliked. He saw very good. Or Ecclesiastes chapter 7 says, "See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." Or Colossians 3 says, I think we read this just before. So I read this out before for the word image in it, but notice also the word renewed. You've put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator, which is a word that gets used again in Ephesians 4 as well. And you think about it, the idea of renewal isn't just the same as being made new. It's being returned to, I suppose it is, but it's being returned to what you were, to that perfection that you had. That new self is being renewed. So there was a knowledge. We were being renewed in knowledge. And then in Ephesians it says, put on the new self created after the likeness of God in true righteousness and holiness. And so there's a righteousness and a holiness and a knowledge and a fullness to humanity that was lost. And that's what we call original righteousness. But then there's also ongoing parts of the natural constitution, like what we are now, that still reflect the image of God. Lots of them, in fact. If you wanted to, you could probably break them down into, I had it in my brain and then it went. So intellectual power, which is really the same thing as that. Natural affections. And what was the last one? Yeah, I mean, you could probably, hang on. Let me just write this one. Yeah. So you could break any of these down into a bunch of bits, and one of those would be communication, right? And I loved when Wayne Grudem talks about these, he kind of got a little bit carried away talking about it, and he goes on about this whole intellectual power bit. So when you think about it, we are created with intellectual power, and one of the things you can do, actually with all of these, is you can get to them by looking at the rest of creation and seeing what it doesn't have. So you talked about Christ didn't come in the form of an elephant, and there's shadowy reflections of these in the animal kingdom, but not like there's this vast gulf between us and animals. So for instance, I'm pretty sure I've written this later on, but I'll say it now. When it comes to intellectual power, and you could put also creativity there, although I think I've got it as a separate thing further on. You look at animals, and like birds, for instance. Birds make nests, right? They're quite clever. They're quite ingenious, the way that birds make nests. But a bird's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchild will make the same nest that its great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather made, right? Whereas, look at this. What do you think when you look at this building?
It's just like the great cathedrals of Europe.
But you're right, it's not, is it? It's so different. I look at it and I think this is a bit dated, isn't it? But the fact that I can look at something that was made 2-3 generations before me or something like that, maybe 4, whatever the early 1900s is to me. That was when they remade it after the fire. That indicates something, doesn't it? We build different things. We build pyramids. We build skyscrapers. We build nuclear silos. We build grain silos. You know, all sorts of things like this endless wealth of creativity and thought and rational consideration. You know, like it gets baffling sometimes. You look at academia, right? And it's this whole world of, well, let's just think about things. And it gets a bit out of hand sometimes. But still, you know, you don't see that in birds. Chickens don't establish schools that I'm aware of. And you know, that goes as well for our natural affections, you know, the ways that we feel. Like you can see some feeling in what animals do. It's not that completely absent, but it's not the same either, like as the grief or the joy that a human being can go through, that was created with moral agency. You know, you get what I mean by moral agency? I mean, so we lost something of our morality when we fell, right? So we ceased to have that original righteousness through original sin. And then, but still, we have conscience. We have an idea of right and wrong. And we make choices between right and wrong. And things are wrong for us and things are right for us. And we understand them to be so when, you know, you wouldn't look at a tiger that hunts down another tiger. You wouldn't look at that and go, that's morally wrong, would you? And neither would the tiger, I suspect. But we do. We have a sense of moral outrage. It's not just, you know, a tiger might be upset if you shoot it and it survives. But I get upset when I hear about people in, you know, the Congo getting shot. Whereas a tiger doesn't care less about a tiger in the Congo if he's not the tiger in the Congo. Yeah, the tiger's getting a bit of a complex metaphor, but you get the point, right? Yeah, another one that people point to is, spirituality. I'm not sure if that's the best word for it, but that idea of us being spirit-infused beings, or having a spirit. Infused was the wrong word there, but so Genesis 2:7, then the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. And from that point on, you get this understood thing in the Bible that man has spirit. That he's not like that is in some way set apart from the animals. That he is reflecting God who is spirit, and man is created spirit as well, though spirit and flesh. Now, hang on. Here's my bit about birds making nests and us making pyramids. Here's a question. Do you think that our bodies reflect the image of God? What if he didn't? Okay, so at the but let's not think about that just yet. Is there still a sense in which our bodies reflect the image of God?
I don't know, but I mean, because
Sure. Is there a sense in which our bodies reflect the image of God in ways other than reflecting the physical body of Christ? There you go.
Well, the Ancient of Days, he passed by, hide someone in the cleft of the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Revelation talks about the Ancient of Days.
Mm-hmm. See, I would answer yes to this. and yes, but you look at what God does and what our bodies do. And although our bodies are not created to look like God's body as a spirit, like we are created to express the functions of what God does in limited ways through the bodies that he has given us. So, for instance, God hears and we hear, right? God is all hearing and all seeing. We're not all hearing, we're not all seeing, but he has given us ears and he's given us eyes in order that we might reflect something of what he is like by the way that we do it. Hang on.
The angels that represent God were like two men appeared,
Yeah.
and they're not human, so to say,
Yeah. No.
but they're being revealed how they're being revealed for the sake of humans.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Doesn't that verse alone, couldn't you write a whole book on how confusing that is? And say probably nothing because we can't quite get our head around it. Like God is all-knowing. Now, of course God's all-knowing. And of course we know things, but it's startlingly easy for us to forget that we know things because he gave us a brain to know things with. We wouldn't know things without a brain to know stuff. And I'll circle back round to creativity. You know, you could probably give it its own listing there, because the whole creation week happens, right? And the first thing that God does is he creates, and then he creates in his image. And from then on in, these people are making stuff. You know, we are inherently creative. Like all of us could share, even if Philip couldn't think of something in the moment, I'm quite sure that all of us could share something that we've made at some point. Whether that has been, that's a song that you've written, whether that's been a building that you've built, or just you know, putting together the barbecue from Bunnings. We build things, an amazing, the soups, there you go. I've heard about the soups actually, there. Yeah. Now, there's another aspect that I want to come to, and I think this is a really important one, and France alluded to it before. Oh, yeah, this one. It's the same aspects, brother. We're coming back to number 3. Ruling. Is to rule a part of what it is to be created in God's image? Well, Genesis 1, right? We circle back around. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over the livestock and over all the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Quite a bit of time is given in those 3 verses to describing or to ascribing dominion to humanity, right? Right up next to, intentionally right up next to, the image of God. The fact that we are created in his image is attached to the command to have dominion. As beings created in the image of God, we were created to express, and cards on the table, yes, I think it is a part of the image of God. We were created to express the good and gracious rule of God over this earth. So being created in God's image means being created to spread the visible rule of God. The word that people often use for this is we are his vice regents, which just means little kings, if you will, or little kings and queens, if you want. Yeah, Phil.
Verse 28
Yeah, go on.
Then God said, "Let us make man in my image, after my likeness."
What version are you reading there?
I'm making a point.
Yeah. So what point are you making?
Well, let us make man in.
Because I can actually see that you have one of the ESVs. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, why didn't God say in my image,
Ah.
in my likeness?
Are you asking a question about the rule bit that I was talking about, or are you bringing up a new question?
Well,
I'm open to both options.
I'm saying here that I'm hearing the our, but we're talking about the one being God. What does it say that?
So are you... Does it say he wasn't?
I'm just bringing it up.
Yeah, yeah. So
I'm not disagreeing with it.
I think what you're trying to do, and I admire you for it, Phil, is you're trying to throw a fox amongst the chickens to see what happens. Because you see something in the passage that you're like, that's a significant point, and you're throwing it out there. Is that what you're doing? That's a great thing to do, by the way.
Yeah, because we're talking about like God, the Ancient of Days,
Mm-hmm.
but we're saying, oh, God this, God that, and all that, and that's all good. I'm not disagreeing with that, but it's saying our, and our mentions our twice in that verse.
Yeah, yeah.
Now,
And so,
she's on the right track because she said something that adds up.
are you asking, is the Trinity implied in the first chapter of the Bible?
It's kind of like you've got to hear things elsewhere to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
a decision.
Yeah. Look, it's funny, isn't it, that in the first 3 chapters of the Bible, there are a great many things that you get in seed form that if you get the rest of the Bible, you understand what they're saying.
That's what I'm
Yeah. And so God says, let us create man in our image. And yes, you look at that and you go, it's funny to make that a plural, isn't it? And yet,
the sun, angels,
yeah.
the Satan,
Well, I think
they're all before man.
yeah, look, yes. And yet I don't think,
No, I'm
no.
just bringing it up. I'm just saying that
But I think
what it's all about.
the strong implication, at least, of Genesis 1 is that God is speaking to God, saying, let us create man in our image and after our likeness. There's at least not given to us in Genesis 1 any indication that there's anyone else present for him to be talking to. I mean, I think quite probably the angels and things there are all created before humanity, but at the same time, so were the cows, and I think we quite rightly read that and go, this is a seed form of the Trinity. We're seeing that God is not just I, God is we.
Very good.
Yeah. Thanks, Phil. I appreciate your approval. But returning to that idea of rule and reign, right, and dominion, I think it's a really important one because it gives us an order of how it was meant to be. So I've taken up a lot of whiteboard on my list. If I can make a little diagram, God rules, man rules creation. Now, obviously, God also rules over creation directly. Like it's not that he leaves creation to itself, but he intentionally creates it this way. And this is a big part of what it is for us to be in his image, is that we are made to express God's rule. And it's very hard for us in a fallen world to quite grasp our heads around what that means because we look at it and we immediately think of dominion and we think of domineering, right? We think of the types of rule that we see and the type of rule that's self-serving, and yet the rule of God, I think what's happening there quite clearly in Genesis, in fact, is that God is creating us to spread. So what's the wording? Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea. And so on and so forth. And so he's, you think about it, and Genesis 2 fills out our idea of what happens in that day as he creates humanity, and he places us in a garden that's perfect and good, but doesn't fill the earth. The garden was in Eden. The garden wasn't in all of the earth. It places it geographically. And the idea is that humanity are created in a world that is good but not perfected, perhaps, or not fallen but not consummate. God has a purpose for it, and the purpose for all of it is not complete until the image of God fills the whole earth. And so we are created then to spread the rule of God and the goodness of God and spread the garden throughout the whole earth as his image bearers. And you could almost just say that our relationship then, creation is meant to look to us and see the goodness of God. Man is meant to look to God, and through looking to God to express his rule. Like as we worship him, we are not ruled by anything else, but we express his rule in the world. Am I expressing myself all right here? Cool.
John, it's interesting how offensive that offered this idea of man having dominion over atheistic worldview.
Yeah. Yeah, because we're just another animal, right? Like we're probably about to discover something else that's better than us anyway. It just hasn't happened for thousands of years.
The word earth, does that mean the planet or the locality of where they are?
I haven't looked into that one. I would have thought it meant, so it can mean the land. You're right. If it's that word that I'm thinking of, but I would have thought actually it means the planet, and it probably implies creation. Would have been my thought. Yeah.
Moving on.
Yeah.
Just going back to what Mark was saying, that this passage gets the blame often for the fact that, humanity has overexploited the earth, kind of, that when the Amazon's getting stripped or something, it's because, man's got this idea that he's got a right to go in and that's coming from here. So
Yeah.
the Bible's actually a very bad thing.
Yeah, which is crazy in a way because, we should look at us stripping out the Amazon and go, that's probably a bad thing, right? Like destroying the giant rainforest and just making it so it doesn't exist, doing it in such an unsustainable way that it just disappears. I think we can agree that that's not great. Yeah, sure. Oh, like you've been to South America. For the video, France was a missionary in South America for 37 years. It's true, you were on the other side of the Andes. I'm getting my geography vaguely right there, right? But yeah, but if that is a bad thing, it is because we are expressing rule, but we're not expressing the rule of God. We're expressing that domineering rule over the creation, that combative rule that is, let's strip out everything I can get and have it for me, rather than let us spread the garden of God throughout the earth and bring order to it. There's a great difference between the chaos of the Amazon, as it stands without humanity, the absence of the Amazon, if you pave it and turn it into a car park. It would be a very big car park, by the way, and very hard for us to imagine, because I don't think anyone's really tried the order of the Amazon if it's Edenified. If it's subdued by and ruled by those who are expressing God's heart for his world and God's glory within it. that would be very different to both of those things, right? Does that make sense? And consider, when we look at this, isn't it significant then that in Genesis 3, what happens? You get, now, it's noteworthy. In Genesis 3, where does it say in Genesis 3 that the serpent was Satan? No, yeah, it does. You're right. And the serpent is Satan. But it's interesting, isn't it? So Genesis 1:28, or 29, sorry. No, it is 28. Have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And then the picture we get in Genesis 3 is that a created thing kind of slithers in here and rules over man, not that it's being intentionally ruled over by God, but Adam and Eve submit themselves to the serpent. They are ruled over by a created thing, and the order becomes reversed. It becomes broken. And not just the serpent. What else are they ruled over by in Genesis 3? This is going to be a very poor diagram. It's meant to be a piece of fruit. I know it's not necessarily an apple. It's probably not. But it doesn't really look like an apple, so there you go. So their heart and desire was to be for God, and he was ruling over them, and through that they were to express God's rule to creation, and creation was to look to them and see the goodness of God. But their heart and desire becomes for this fruit, and this serpent rules, that's a squiggly serpent, rules over them, right? And the whole thing breaks on this, that it's not just they ate a piece of fruit, right? It's that they denied this core thing of what they were created to be. They deny the rule of God over them, and they deny worshipping him, and so they're unable to rule within the creation because they're being ruled by the creation. Does that make sense? And isn't that an unchanged problem in many ways? Like what is the nature of sin today? The nature of sin is that you're being ruled over by the things that you were meant to rule over, that you were meant to be bringing order to, that you were meant that we're meant to submit to God's rule through humanity. And when someone, greed is just such a beautifully easy example. That desire for more things, and you're being ruled over by the things rather than ruling over them.
3:22, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil.
Yeah.
So grab the tree of life before they get hold of it, or otherwise you're going to be screwed.
Is that the Passion Translation? So, I don't think that's a fair assessment.
That the fall that they had that knowledge.
It's funny, isn't it? Because they're not created without the knowledge of good and evil in one sense. Like, what do they get when they eat the fruit? They don't gain the power to know what is right and wrong because they've already done that, haven't they? When God said, don't eat from the tree, they gained a sense of what is wrong and what is right, right? They had a yes and they had a no. What does it mean that they...
But lack of experience.
Knowing.
I remember years ago, it was silly, in a kid's talk, something that really sort of, I thought this was brilliant. And it's talking about, Adam and Eve hiding. And God says, where are you? And Adam says, here I am, I'm hiding. Like
It's so true.
playing hide and seek, because he hasn't actually learnt yet how to deceive.
It's, yeah.
And this is, you know, they are innocent. I mean, they've just lost their innocence, but nevertheless, you know that they're innocent in so many ways.
With all of our kids, the first game of hide and seek comes to something like this, where they're like, and you're like, where are you? And they're like, I'm here. And they're like, no, you're not meant to tell me that yet. I'm under the table. You're actually not under the table. You're almost, your head's under the table. It's astute. Let me. You notice I cleared the board, and that's because there's one other thing I really wanted to dig into before we get to the Jesus bit here, and we're chewing on a bit. I think you'll learn some really interesting things from the context, not just of when Genesis 1 happened, but when Genesis 1 was written. So it's written for a people at a time, right? So when's Genesis written? Traditionally, I mean, we don't actually get it specifically laid out for us in the Bible, but most people think, or most Bible scholars, especially evangelical Bible scholars, think that Moses writes Genesis, right? Writes the first 5 books of the Bible sometime after leaving Egypt. Okay, and so that's an interesting context because it's being written for those people originally to read it. And so what was their context? Well, in the ancient Near East, in that area, one really important fact is that kings, I won't write this, kings would set themselves up an image, so of themselves. Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, right? The Epic of Gilgamesh, But you quite frequently in the ancient world, and there's loads of archaeological evidence for this, but I don't have it here, by the way. So if you said where, I would go, I'll have to go and find that. But all the time, kings in these ancient cultures would set up images of themselves as kind of a reminder to their kingdom, a representation of their rule to people. Because, you know, in the days before television and radio and not to mention social media and stuff, how do you remind the guys over on the other side of your empire that you're still their king? Coins, that's one. Images. The other one's armies, obviously, but relevant to our conversation is images. You know, how do you remind the army, though? Images. And so you would have statues of the king, and you would have, later, not that far in, coins with a picture of the king. Not just to say this is the wealth of the Roman Empire, but to say, just remember, he's the king. And so they would set up images. There's 2 other places that images show up really prominently in these ancient cultures around this time, especially actually the Egyptians would do these things, which I think is very significant when you think about it. We'll get to that. One is idols. So that's a pretty clear one, right? So what was an idol? An idol represented the presence of the god. So it wasn't usually just considered a thing that was like a reminder of the god, but it was an actual, you could experience the god's presence through this carved thing, was the idea. A means of the god's presence among his people, his or her people. Now, it's interesting, the word image in Genesis 1 is not the word that gets used for idol in the Old Testament, but it is used somewhat frequently to describe idols in the Old Testament. So, for instance, Numbers 33:52 says, "Then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you." We'll get to this when we do Numbers later this year. "And destroy all their figured stones and destroy all their metal images." Same word. "And demolish all their high places." Or 2 Kings 11, "Then all the people of the land went to the house of Baal and tore it down. His altars and his images they broke in pieces." or Ezekiel, his beautiful ornament they used for pride, and they made their abominable images and their detestable things of it. And so what, for the Israelites, having just come out of Egypt, right, idol worshipping Egypt, there's a really good way to read the plagues of Egypt as actually specifically targeted attacks on the gods of Egypt. Not that they were actual gods, but like, I love that it starts with the Nile turning to blood, because the Nile, centrally important to the infrastructure of Egypt and the existence of Egypt, is their one fresh water source, right? But it's also, as a result of that, it's become a thing that they worship a lot by that point, and has been for a really long time. The Nile is not just a river, the Nile is a god. There's a god of the Nile, and God kills the Nile. Like, why did he turn it into blood? Why didn't he turn it into oil? Because he wanted to make a point, your river, like, this isn't a thing worth worshipping. I just knocked it out by hitting it with a stick. But I deter. What was I saying? Israel have just come out of that context of image worship, of gods who set up their images, and they are these stone or gold or wood things that they don't do anything, and then they get given the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. They get given Genesis 1, and God tells them what his image is that he has set up in the earth. Humanity. His images speak. His images are active. It's interesting. Psalm 115, I think this is a really significant passage on the whole, but it talks about idolatry. It says, their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths but do not speak, eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear, noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel, feet but do not walk, and they do not make a sound in their throat. Those who make them become like them. So do all who trust in them. That, by the way, establishes a fantastically important principle, which is worth living your life by, which is you become like the things that you worship. So if you worship, this is saying, if you worship idols, you actually reduce in being. We talked about many of those things that just described, the hearing and the smelling and the walking and the speaking as aspects of us in the image of God. And you actually, when you worship false things, you degrade the image of God and your capacity to express it. The Bible takes some pretty clear digs at this. It does not approve of idol worship. I don't know if that's come up for you. So, for instance, Habakkuk 2:18-19 says, what profit is an idol when its maker has shaped it, a metal image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own creation when he makes speechless idols. Woe to him who says to a wooden thing, awake, to a silent stone, arise. Can this teach? Behold, it's overlaid with gold and silver. There's no breath at all in it. Or I quite like, so Isaiah 44, and I was going to read you a longer passage here, but I'll just do the short version. So 13 to 20 was the big thing, but it's talking about idolatry, and it's quite mocking of idolatry. It talks about the man who makes an idol. He plants a cedar, and the rain nourishes it. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes a part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he makes a god and worships it. From the same thing, He makes it an idol and falls down before it. And you don't have to wonder what Isaiah's saying, right? He's like, hey, isn't this dumb? The thing that you're worshipping is also what you chuck in the fire. It's the same thing, guys. Isn't this crazy? And an image was a sacred thing in these ancient cultures, right? What's someone help me out here. What's that instance it's in Genesis where it's either Jacob's wife or Isaac's wife steals the household gods of Laban, maybe, of her father, and she leaves and she pretends she's on her period so she doesn't have to get off the camel and show him, and hides them there. But doesn't that express the outrage, right? When you take the gods, you're not meant to do that. That's a sacred thing for them. It's a way of the God expressing and representing their presence, even though it's not a God at all. And so God has set up his image. I almost called it God has set up his idol in the earth, but it's not an idol because an idol is a false God. And he hasn't set us up as gods. We're not made to be gods. We're made to express who is the real God through who we are. And that's huge part of why we're not to worship idols, right? Because God has decided a way that he is to be made known. You know, when the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, do you remember that when Moses goes up the mountain and they make Aaron says, "Hey, bring me all your gold," and he forms a calf. Later. I love that. He's like, when Moses comes back, he's like, "Well, hang on a minute. Don't get angry. I dropped some gold in the fire. Out came the calf." Nice one, Aaron. But it doesn't actually explicitly say that like Aaron makes them this calf and he says, "Behold the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." And they worship it as God. And like maybe even they're trying to worship God and they're just going, we just want something to worship to represent him, because this is what all the nations that we've been to are like, right? But God says, no, you must not worship an image. Why must you not worship an image? God has set up an image in the earth. And he said that this is what I'm like. And when we worship another thing, we say, well, that's what God's like. And we fundamentally misunderstand God. He's set up an expression of his presence in the earth. Idols were meant to be an expression of the presence of the false God. God's presence in the earth is meant to be expressed through his people. The other one, so we had idols, right? And the other one's kings. That's maybe even at least as significant, maybe even more, in many of the ancient cultures, especially Egypt, Assyria a bit as well, and some others. The kings were called images of the God that they served. It was thought that they had special access to the God, reflected the God. So pharaohs from like 1550 at least BC, you get these references in tablets and things to the God, to God speaking to pharaohs. Now, obviously, there's a fair bit of imagination in the making of these tablets, but Amosis the First, for instance, in the 16th century BC, gets called by Ra an image of Ra. Or Amenophis the Third, I might be getting his name poorly pronounced, but he's been dead for like 3,500 years, so he'll be all right. He gets called my living image by the god Amun. And Amun-Ra says to him, you are my beloved son, my image. I have given to you to rule the earth in peace. Now that's really interesting. Did you hear what he said there? Not just you are my image. So kings had this idea of image, but also of sonship. And this is big. This was a thing. This was big. The context that the Israelites heard what God was saying to them in Genesis 1 they understood that kings are the ones who get set up in the earth to represent the God as their images and sons. And so we can now I'm not saying understand, I'm not saying Genesis 1 was written as a response to all of this and made up in response to all of that. But rather that God expresses Genesis 1, the truth of Genesis 1, and he's chosen for that to come about in a way that the Israelites reading it would have gone, wow, so God has set humanity up as his kings in the earth when they saw that humanity was created in the image of God. You know, not kings over him, but as his vice regents, like we said before, set up to rule, set up to be the kings, set up to be the image of God as well. And sonship is implied in that as well. That they're set up to be his children not in the personal way that we get in the New Testament so much, but in the way that the king was called a son of the God. You know, I think it's really easy to forget the way that the Israelites would have felt at this point. It's easy. We read our Bibles, and you get, Joseph and his brothers, and Joseph goes down to Egypt, and then the whole family comes down to Egypt a little while later, and then Moses is doing his stuff. And it's very easy to forget, like, roughly the time span of the whole of the existence of Europeans in North America has happened between those 2 points, right? A couple of 100 years more than Australia, well, 100 years more at least than Australia with European settlement has happened between Joseph and Moses. And so they, as much, like, how much do you feel like an Australian? You don't feel English, do you? And that's because we've got this big, long history of being in Australia, right? And so imagine then that the Israelites have been in Egypt for 400 years, and this is the culture that they've just lived in the middle of for this whole time. This idol worshipping, this culture where kings are the image and the sons of the gods. And then they come out and God says, I created man in my image, in the image of God. Let us create man in our image and after our likeness. And for them, it would have been an easy light bulb. And I've just undermined a lot of what I was about to say. That's okay. Not undermined, just accidentally said stuff earlier, and I'm going to get confused a bit. So the Bible is given in a context, though radically different to the context. Do you see? Where image and sonship and kingship are a thing that the Egyptians, they said, this guy, this Pharaoh, he's the one who is the image of God. He's the one of the Son of God. And the Assyrians as well, and all these other cultures were said, this king, he's where you see the image of God. There's an Assyrian reference somewhere where they do kind of say something like, men are but shadows of gods, and the king is the image of him. And so you get this kind of almost idea that there's something of the image of God in everyone, and yet God says, no, I set up humanity to be my image in the earth. It's not one special, separate one of you who's meant to be domineering over the rest and given the right to do that. It also implies that kingship is the intention for all of humanity in the end. That's what redeemed and right and perfected humanity is meant to be like. That's what the image of God is meant to be like. Which brings us to Jesus, the image of the invisible God. Right? And I'm sorry, we start a whole new term and I go back to having no time organisation. Sorry. So what passages, we're jumping into the New Testament now, letting France off the leash, because you wanted to jump to Jesus right at the beginning, and rightly so. Let that always be our urge. But what bits of the New Testament come to mind when you think of Jesus as in relation to the image of God? Any parts of the Bible? So connect that to me. Yeah. I and the Father are one. So, and so primarily, I think we'd look at that rightly and see Jesus claiming deity. I don't think any of us, even in perfect, redeemed, eternal new heavens and new earth, are going to be able to say, I and the Father are one. Not in that sense, anyway. Although, not that long afterwards, Jesus does say that he wants us to be one with him as he and the Father are one. So there is a sense of that oneness, though not in quite the same way. Anything else?
In Luke's genealogy, Jesus blah, 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 down to Adam, and Adam is the son of God. There's sort of connection.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose then all of those New Testament passages that refer to Jesus as the new Adam, or the last Adam as well, yeah.
The Lamb's Book of Life before the foundation of the world.
How does it connect to the image of God? Help me out.
Before the foundation of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Connects it with God.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the beginning God was.
Yeah.
I am.
Yep. For sure. Yeah. Colossians 1:15 is the low-hanging fruit that I almost already read out for us anyway. So he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Help me out. I don't think I've got that one written down.
Probably a lot.
Yeah, I think there is. It's nice to spitball a few, I think. But
He is the radiance, verse 3, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power.
can't believe I didn't think of that. It's very clear, isn't it? Well, John 1:1, or the Word was with God and the Word was God, and then you get to the end of the prologue, and do you remember the last verse of the prologue? John 1:18. No one has ever seen God. The only. Yeah. Or no one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. No, I mean, whatever. But, what does Jesus do? What did Jesus come to do? What does John want us to know that Jesus came to do at the end of his prologue to his gospel? He comes to make God known. You want to know who God is? You look at Jesus.
The Jews knew because they wanted to kill him.
Yeah, well, they knew that he claimed to be at the very least.
Come from his lips.
Yeah. So 2 Corinthians is another noteworthy inclusion. In their case, the God of this world is 2 Corinthians 4:4-5. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord. So, isn't this wonderful news? And I can't help but think of Revelation 5 and the search for the one who is worthy to open the seal, break the seals and open the scroll, and no one was found worthy in all of the earth. But weep no more. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has overcome. And where we are fallen images, marred images, broken images, not completely taken away, not completely there, but Jesus is the perfect image of God. What do you think of some implications of that? What does that mean for us, that Jesus is the image of God?
It helps us understand God a lot more because we can read about Jesus, we know of Jesus, and
Yeah.
understanding.
Yeah.
No salvation in any other name under heaven.
Yeah. What
Tick it out of here.
What does it mean for us as image bearers of God, that Jesus is the perfect image of God? Yeah. And we'll circle to that too. Certainly one thing, if we want to see what it looks like to practice being the image of God in a fallen world, we look at Jesus. That is, if we want to see the sort of life that we should live, look to Jesus. Yeah, well, yes, yeah, but then also gives us grace to keep going and to grow. I think that's really obvious sometimes, isn't it? So when you think about, say, let's go back to those categories that I scrubbed off the board prematurely, of where the image of God is seen in humanity. When you think of the moral righteousness of Jesus, that's quite an easy way to see. Wow, look at his morality and look at our morality. Look at his goodness and look at our other stuff. You can look at that and you go, wow, he is the image of God and shows us what it is. Do you get what I'm saying here? Is that Jesus, sometimes we just look at Jesus and we think he is the one who shows us what God is like, and that's true. But we're meant to show what God is like as his image bearers in the earth. And so if we want to see what humanity is like, right humanity created to be, as it was created to be, we look at Jesus, right? So we look at his moral righteousness, we look at his intellect and his reason and his affections and how he expressed all these things. Maybe where it's less obvious, and you said this just before, Franz, his rule and authority, I don't think that in a fallen world it is natural for us, fallen nature natural, to look at Jesus and think, wow, that guy ruled, that guy had dominion, right? Like, what do we think of when we think of dominion? We think of kings and castles and armies and coins and sorry? Yeah, heavy hand. At very least speaking softly but carrying a big stick, right? And yet, in an upside-down world, Jesus ruled because he alone was not dominated. He ruled over the created things. Now, he didn't rule over the created things like we think of ruling over the created things, but he shows us what the expression of God's rule in this world is meant to look like. Thus, what the image of God, as those who are in his image to rule and have dominion, are meant to look like. He followed the will of the Father. You remember the diagram that we had over here with the snake and the apple and stuff like that? Jesus wasn't dominated by the snake and the apple. He wasn't dominated by the desire for created things. His worship wasn't for the created things, and so he wasn't ruled over by the created things. He was ruled by God alone. Godly ruling in a fallen world is not about self-service, it's about serving yourself, but about laying yourself down and about being freed to do that by the fact that you don't need these things in this world because you're ruled by God alone and he is your desire and you cannot lose him. That's the image of God lived out. When you refuse sin, you're expressing the rule of God in this world. Yeah. He goes out into the wilderness and Satan does the most explicit job of trying to tempt anyone ever and just comes straight up and goes, hey, bow down and worship me. And Jesus is ruled by God, not by the created things. Yeah. Well, ruled by God as expressed in his word. Yeah. When you live in accordance with his will, laying yourself down for others, counting the cost and being willing to stand up for faith, you may have negative worldly results for that, right? It might not feel a lot like ruling in a lot of ways because you lose some of the created things when you do those things. And maybe you lose your grip over the created things when you lose those things, when you do those things, but you're living out the kingship that God's called you to because you are ruled by him and not being dominated by the creation. by desire to have it, by the need to serve it. I think another really fun implication of this, and we're very close to finishing on this, is that the things that we see in Jesus and think that's a God thing. Now, got to be careful what I say, how I say this. Not everything about Jesus is true about us. But I think a lot of things that are true about Jesus that we see in the Gospels are perhaps also expressions of what it looks like to be the perfected image of God. You can have a lot of fun with this as a line of thought. You know, a lot of things in Jesus you see and you go, if that's what it looks like, even within a fallen world, to be the image of God, what's it going to be like in a new heavens and new earth? You know, so like the disciples are out on the water and there's the storm and everything and they're drowning and Jesus comes for a stroll out on the waves. Like, will there be storms in the new heavens and new earth? And will we be just so much the image of God that that's not an issue for us? Yeah, well, he wasn't even surfing them, was he? He was just strolling them. Yeah, and not just walking on water, calming the storm. Like what more clear expression of the rule of God over creation than be still and the waves stop and the wind and the sails dripping and you can hear the dripping because it's so quiet, right?
I'm not sure if you're going, I mean, I
Go on.
sometimes wonder, you know, with that incident of Jesus walking on the water and calming the storm, is used generally as an example of his divinity. And I think it is. But, you know, I sometimes wonder whether we're not supposed to be also seeing it as, you know, the perfect man.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. You know, perfect man as he walks on the waves, perfect man as he lays himself down on the cross. This is what humanity is meant to look like. And the one very perfect man does it perfectly, and everyone else stuffs it up. But it's noteworthy, you know, for us as believers in Jesus, for those who trust in him, we must realize that we are meant to be being restored into the image of God through him, in him. You know, the New Testament's common terminology for Christians isn't Christians. That doesn't really come up. It's like in Acts once or something. The most common term is in Christ, right? That comes up a lot. And that's important because all that we are, all that we gain, all that God is achieving in us is through that connection, through the fact that we are in him. It is via Christ that we are becoming the image of God again. You know, we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord who is Spirit. That's 2 Corinthians 3:18. Or you know, I love 1 John 3, and partly because it expresses this wonderful mystery of what's going to happen when Jesus comes back. Beloved, we are God's children now. And what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. You know, like we're gonna. It's that diagram of God, man, creation, and it's restored, and we become like him because we are in right connection with him, and we see him as he is, and we worship him as he is, and so we are restored to being like him through worship of him. You know, Jesus is the fulfillment of the mandate to fill the earth with the image of God. That's what is being one of the great things that is achieved in Christ. The original command to multiply was definitively biological reproduction. That's what that was talking about, I'm pretty sure. But it's interesting how in Christ, as his followers, we too are called to multiply, and it becomes a broader definition of multiply, doesn't it? It's not just have babies. In fact, it's not primarily have babies. Having babies is in itself not such a fantastic thing if they don't then come into the family of God, and we multiply not just through birth but by new birth, multiply his image in the earth. We are called to multiply image bearers as we spread the gospel of God throughout this world. Isn't that an amazing thing we've been called into? Not just, sometimes we think of evangelism in small terms, and the small terms are great. Someone got saved out of hell, and that's great. But also the image of God filling the whole earth, such that what was intended at the beginning, fall or not, God will achieve by the end. His image will be all over the earth. Isn't that great? Isn't God amazing? Isn't he unstoppable? Isn't he worth being the image of? 1,000 billion times over. Trillion, that's what that word is.